I first heard the name James Douglas in 1973, in the summer of 73. I was spending some days at a Trappist monastery in Spencer, Massachusetts, and I had a number of very, very wonderful discussions with an Irish Trappist from Brooklyn, New York, named Ansel Gorman. And Brother Gorman, in the course of one of our discussions, said, "You know, there is a writer you would really like. His name's James Douglas, and he's written this book, Resistance and Contemplation," which I know many people here have read. And a few weeks after that, I got the book, and I read shortly thereafter that, The Nonviolent Cross. Coming here to Seattle, I think we first met in Wisconsin at a Fellowship of Reconciliation gathering in 1974, but I got to know Jim in the course of the resistance movement against the Trident submarine here. As everyone here, or many of us here know, Jim is an inveterate and dedicated activist for peace and justice, and his recent book, JFK and the Unspeakable, is a stunning reassessment of the John F. Kennedy assassination that Daniel Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers, has said it's the first book of all of the books he's encountered on this subject to move him to call for a new criminal investigation. Today is the 40th anniversary of Robert F. Kennedy's death, and it's fitting that Jim be here with us tonight. So please welcome our brother in struggle, James Douglas.
I don't want to be responsible for Joe Martin going to his death off the podium. Joe is responsible in other ways for my being here, because when we went to Seattle Mariner baseball games in the 90s, he would always ask me questions about the assassination of John Kennedy while I was trying to watch the ball game. I couldn't get anywhere in the ball game without him peppering me with these questions. And eventually it began to sink in a little bit, and has been sinking in more and more. Maybe I should share a little bit about the journey of going into this, because it's been a fairly long journey, actually longer than the questions in the ball game, because it goes back to the assassination of Martin Luther King. That was the one that changed my life. And that was when I was at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu and teaching a course on the theology of peace. And the students took it very seriously, so much so that when Dr. King was assassinated, April 4, '68, in the first class we had after that, they several of them came in late and said they had an announcement to share with the rest of us, and they had a little gathering on the other side of the campus. And because Dr. King had given his life for justice and peace in resistance to the Vietnam War, in envisioning a nation and a world without poverty, they had taken a stand against the war and burned their draft cards and formed what they called the Hawaii Resistance. And some of those young men went to jail for 6 months, some for 2 years. And of course, when they made this announcement, they looked at me, so-called professor, and invited me to join their group. And they're very politely saying, "Mr. Professor of Nonviolence, put up or shut up." And so I did join their group, and beginning of the end of my academic career, but ground zero was ahead, and all kinds of wonderful people, a number of whom are in this room. So that baptism from Martin Luther King and from the students was a kind of transforming moment. And I've tried to understand his assassination, especially because of the impact it had on me, and all of us in that community. And it took a long time to begin to get any real direction and understanding of it. Certainly suspicions that it wasn't James Earl Ray by himself. But in the late 90s, I did have the opportunity to attend the only trial ever held for King's assassination from November 15th to December 8th, 1999 in Memphis. And I heard 70 witnesses testify to a sophisticated government plot that involved CIA, FBI, Memphis Police Department, an Army sniper team, mafia intermediaries, you name it. They were there in various respects. And the jury, 6 black and 6 white members of the jury, concluded that, yes, in that wrongful death lawsuit, Dr. King had been assassinated by a conspiracy that included government agents. That's explicitly in the verdict. And not too many people heard about it, which was very striking, very striking. At one point in the trial, the woman next to me, who was a reporter from a Lisbon newspaper, who was there for several days, she turned to me and said, looking around at the other dozen or so spectators, that Americans said the Simpson trial was the trial of the century. Americans said the Clinton trial was the trial of the century. She said, this is the trial of the century. And who's here? A reporter from a Lisbon newspaper, and you, a writer of books. So that raised a lot of questions for me, especially when I talked to the witnesses and saw the nature of the plot and the depth of it. And by that time, I was already beginning to work by analogy and by a deepening conviction on Malcolm X and John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. And the next book will hopefully be on Malcolm and Martin, and the final one on Robert Kennedy. It's the same story 4 times over. John Kennedy is in some ways the most amazing story to me because, Malcolm and Martin were prophets, and Robert Kennedy was, of course, changed profoundly by the death of his brother and moved in a new direction. But John Kennedy was actually president of the United States, and to discover what I didn't know at all when he was alive, to discover that he was turning in a biblical sense, so profoundly in the direction of peacemaking that his national security state found it necessary from the standpoint of the powers that be to assassinate him. That was to me, and is, astounding. That's to me the major lesson of what I learned. It's not the depth of evil that killed him, which is very great. It is that he had the courage in a position that became more and more and more isolated during his presidency. He had the courage to stand against the most powerful state in history, and particularly at its most critical moment. That's what I found hard to believe. So in trying to write about this, I've had to use a spiritual guide, or follow a spiritual guide, and that's Thomas Merton. And the way he is a spiritual guide for me, well, there are many ways in which he's a spiritual guide for me, but the way he is in the book is by raising questions in his perspective, in his letters, in his writings, and then I've tried to follow those questions as far as I can in the book. And the unspeakable is the term that he coined in his own book, Raids on the Unspeakable, and it's the perspective of Kennedy's assassination because what he said one of the awful facts of our age is the evidence that the world is stricken indeed, stricken to the very core of its being by the presence of the unspeakable. And by that he meant the kind of evil that was evident in the Vietnam War, in the race to a global war, and in these assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. And he felt that there was a depth of evil whose depth and deceit seemed to go beyond the capacity of words to describe. And that's what I found in the assassination. I want to try to sum up as shortly as possible what the story is all about. And this is the way it goes. It's a story that I've tried to tell chronologically and point by point through a sea of witnesses, or a lot of witnesses. And in brief, that story is, on our behalf, he was President of the United States, so on our behalf, at the height of the Cold War, John F. Kennedy risked committing the greatest crime in history, starting a nuclear war. Before we knew it, he turned toward peace with the enemy who almost committed that crime with him. For turning to peace with his enemy and ours, Kennedy was murdered by a power we cannot easily describe. Its unspeakable reality can be traced, suggested, recognized, and pondered. That is one purpose of this book. The other is to describe Kennedy's turning. And then the hope is that by following the story of JFK's encounter with the unspeakable, we will be willing to encounter it too. There are a series of turning points. The first key one is the Bay of Pigs, but I want to concentrate on the most critical one, in fact, the most critical point in history, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we almost went to a total nuclear war. And this is the climactic moment. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nikita Khrushchev said something totally unexpected to his foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko. He said, "We have to let Kennedy know that we want to help him." As Khrushchev's son Sergei describes that surprising moment, his father hesitated to use the word help in response to John Kennedy's plea for precisely that. When Khrushchev did say the word aloud, it forced him to ask himself, did he really want to help his enemy, Kennedy? Yet Khrushchev knew from his secret correspondence with the US president that had been going on for a year, smuggling letters back and forth, that the two men agreed in their correspondence on Noah's Ark as a crucial symbol of their common predicament in the nuclear age. The precarious boat in which they and all of humanity were living on a sea of conflict had to stay afloat. After a short silence inspired by the sense of his word help, Khrushchev repeated it to a wondering Gromyko. Yes, help. We now have a common cause to save the world from those pushing us toward war. In that grace-filled moment, Nikita Khrushchev, his new partner, John Kennedy, and the world with them went from darkness to dawn. What especially moved Khrushchev to help Kennedy by withdrawing the Soviet missiles from Cuba was Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynen's description of his meeting with Robert Kennedy, our brother who died 40 years ago today. The president's brother was exhausted. Dobrynen could see from Robert Kennedy's eyes that he hadn't slept for days. RFK told him the president, quote, didn't know how to resolve the situation. The military is putting great pressure on him, insisting on military actions against Cuba, and the president is in a very difficult position. Even if he doesn't want or desire a war, something irreversible could occur against his will. That is why the president is asking for help to solve this problem. In his memoirs, Khrushchev repeated a further chilling sentence from Robert Kennedy's appeal to Dobrynen. He said, if the situation continues much longer, the president is not sure that the military will not overthrow him and seize power. Sergei has described his father's thoughts when he read Dobrynen's report relaying the Kennedys' plea. The president was calling for help. That was how father interpreted Robert Kennedy's talk with our ambassador. The tone of the conversation was evidence of the fact that to delay could be fatal. The temperature in the Washington boiler had apparently reached a dangerous point and was about to explode. Half a world apart in radical ideological conflict, both Kennedy in his call for help and Khrushchev in his response had recognized their interdependence with each other and the world. They suddenly joined hands. After threatening to destroy the world, the two enemies turned to each other in desperation and grace. Instead of annihilation, they chose, in Khrushchev's words, a common cause to save the world from those pushing us towards war. Khrushchev's decision to help Kennedy in the missile crisis was reciprocated by Kennedy's helping Khrushchev by the American University Address, which was June 10, 1963. That address is to John Kennedy's assassination, as Martin Luther King's April 4, 1967 address at Riverside Church is to his assassination. It's the why. In the American University, Kennedy, in effect, called for an end to the Cold War. He reached out to his enemy, Nikita Khrushchev. He said, I will not test a nuclear weapon again unless somebody else does. And he said, I want a nuclear test ban. And Khrushchev and he signed it within 6 weeks of that event. Khrushchev said it was the greatest speech an American president had given since Roosevelt. Both men, both John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, were ready for more and more cooperation. Neither of them wanted the Cold War to continue. The deepening Kennedy-Khrushchev détente was the larger context of the unfolding plot to assassinate Kennedy. It had become clear to America's power brokers that the president of their national security state was struggling with his communist opponent, not so much over who would win the Cold War as on how to end it. From a national security standpoint, the president had become a traitor. I guess I should say something about the crime scene. The plot to kill the president is a very elaborate one, and Dealey Plaza is only the final statement, the actual killing of Kennedy. The plot especially focuses on Lee Harvey Oswald, who was an agent, an operative, a person who had worked with the CIA as a Marine, who was a radar operator with a crypto clearance in the Far East, who was at Atsugi Air Force Base. who then became, after his Marine career, a false defector under the direction of the counterintelligence branch of the CIA, a man named James Jesus Angleton, and who was then moved stage by stage toward Dallas and eventually into the vicinity of Dealey Plaza so he could be scapegoated while snipers killed the president. Lee Harvey Oswald was painted red by association with Fidel Castro, by his being impersonated by people who went to the Cuban and Soviet consulates in Mexico City in the fall of 1963 in his name, and who prepared a scenario which would have used the assassination of the president as the basis for an attack on Cuba and the Soviet Union. When it got to the actual crime scene, I'll just describe a little bit of it. The assassins of the president controlled the crime scene, Dealey Plaza, from the beginning. When witnesses instinctively stormed the grassy knoll to chase a shooter who was apparently behind the fence at the top, they immediately encountered plainclothesmen identifying themselves as Secret Service agents. These men facilitated and covered up the escape of the triggermen if they were not themselves the triggermen shielded by Secret Service credentials. The shooters had the official documentation of the Secret Service, and so they just walked away from the scene of the crime showing their credentials. After President Kennedy was shot when his limousine passed through Dealey Plaza, Dallas police officer Joe Marshall was one of the first people to rush up the grassy knoll and behind its stockade fence. As he reported to his superiors, he smelled gunpowder right away. He told the Warren Commission that when he encountered a man in the parking lot behind the fence, I pulled my pistol from my holster and I thought, this is silly, I don't know who I'm looking for, and I put it back. Just as I did, he showed me that he was a Secret Service agent. The Secret Service agent, in quotes, was well prepared to discourage anyone like Officer Smith who might challenge his being behind the fence where someone had just shot the president. He saw me coming with my pistol, Smith said, and right away he showed me who this was. No one had a more revealing view than did witness Ed Hoffman of what the phony Secret Service agents were facilitating and covering up. Ed Hoffman was uniquely qualified to serve as an eyewitness. He had trained himself to see more sharply than most people because he lacked one sense they had, hearing. Ed Hoffman was a deaf mute. His keen eyewitness testimony has given us eyes to see behind the fence. On the morning of November 22nd, Ed Hoffman, 27 years old, was excused from his job in a machine shop at Texas Instruments in North Dallas because he had broken a tooth. When he was driving to the dentist, he was reminded by seeing the crowds of people along the street that President Kennedy was visiting Dallas that day. Hoffman momentarily forgot about his tooth and decided to stop and see the president, who was expected in a little less than an hour. He parked his car on the broad shoulder of Stemmons Freeway just west of Dealey Plaza and walked to a point where he would be able to look down from the freeway into the president's car when it passed below him. He found he also had a panoramic view of the railroad bridge at Dealey Plaza and the area adjoining it behind the wooden fence at the top of the grassy knoll. Although he was standing beside a freeway roaring with traffic, he heard none of it. In the 45 minutes before the presidential motorcade arrived, Ed Hoffman became completely absorbed in watching the activities of two men behind the stockade fence at the top of the grassy knoll. He saw a stocky man in a dark business suit and black hat standing near the fence. In Ed Hoffman's mind, this was the suit man. The second man Hoffman observed was tall, thin, and dressed like a railroad worker. The railroad man stood waiting by the switch box at the railroad tracks, where the tracks, after passing across the bridge, ran perpendicular to the fence. Hoffman was puzzled by the fact that the two men, although dressed quite differently, seemed to be working together. The suit man kept walking back and forth between the fence and the switch box, where he would confer with the railroad man. When Hoffman sensed that the presidential limousine, which he could not actually see, was approaching, he saw the suit man walk over to the railroad man a final time, speak briefly, and returned to the fence. The suit man crouched down and stood up, apparently picking something up. He looked over the fence. In the silent drama Ed Hoffman was watching, he then saw a puff of smoke by the suit man. He assumed it was from a cigarette. He soon realized the smoke had come from the firing of a rifle he was unable to hear. Hoffman saw the suit man turn suddenly with a rifle in his hands. He ran to the railroad man, tossing the rifle to him over a thin horizontal pipe about 4 feet off the ground. The railroad man caught the rifle, breaking it down with a twist. He thrust it in a railroad worker's soft brown tool bag and ran north along the tracks. The suit man turned back, assumed a casual pose, and began strolling alongside the fence. A police officer came quickly around the fence and confronted the suit man with a revolver. The suit man held out his empty hands. He then took what was apparently identification out of his coat pocket and showed it to the police officer. The officer put his gun away. The suit man mingled with the crowd of people that was coming around the fence. Ed Hoffman's attention switched to the presidential limousine as it was then being driven below him onto Stemmons Freeway. He looked down on President Kennedy's body, sprawled across the back seat with a gaping wound in his right rear skull. It looked like bloody jello. Hoffman was unable to see anything more behind the fence. A slowly moving freight train had crossed the railroad bridge and was blocking his view. Realizing he had witnessed the assassination of the president, he became overwhelmed by the need to let people know that he had seen the man with a rifle. He ran to his car. He made visits to Dallas Police Headquarters and the FBI office that proved futile. In the wake of the assassination, no one was patient enough to understand a seemingly obsessed man who was unable to speak. Witness Ed Hoffman, for years, followed his father's and his uncle's counsel that he keep quiet about the assassination. His uncle was in the Dallas Police Department. And then, compelled by his conscience and without his father's knowledge, he made an appointment with the Dallas FBI office to try to reveal it. And with no sign language interpreter present, he tried to give his testimony on what he had seen behind the fence. And the result of his use of gestures, sketches, and notes made up of sentence fragments was that the FBI refused to understand him, yet they threatened him. They threatened him with gestures that indicated that if he did not accept a bribe of $500, that he would be liable to severe consequences. And that was the pattern of Ed Hoffman's life for year after year as he tried repeatedly to reveal his knowledge of the assassination and received incomprehension and threats. John F. Kennedy was conscious that he was moving into deeper and deeper waters. And so I just want to give one indication before we have some questions as to what was going on within him. His biographer, Ralph Martin, observed at one point that Kennedy talked a great deal about death and about the assassination of Lincoln. There was one point, his conscious model for struggling truthfully through conflict and being ready to die as a consequence was Abraham Lincoln. On the day when Kennedy and Khrushchev resolved the missile crisis, and Robert Kennedy came into the Oval Office to sit with his brother and think and talk, JFK told his brother Robert, referring to the assassination of Lincoln, this is the night I should go to the theater. And Robert looked at him and said, if you go, I want to go too. And that would happen to both of them soon. Kennedy had been preparing himself for the same end that Lincoln met during his night at the theater. There was a point at which after the meeting he had with Khrushchev in Vienna at an early stage of their relationships and a very discouraging one. He was in a plane going back to Washington, D.C., and his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, after he fell asleep working with papers in the plane, discovered a scrap of paper under his desk, and she picked it up, and it had a statement by Abraham Lincoln in Kennedy's handwriting that reappears in his life and in talks he gives. And that statement is a prayer of Lincoln's that Kennedy had adopted. It goes, "I know there is a God, and I see a storm coming. If he has a place for me, I believe that I am ready." In his final months, the president spoke with friends about his own death with a freedom and frequency that shocked them. Some of them found it abnormal. Senator George Smathers said, "I don't know why it was, but death became kind of an obsession with Jack." Yet if one understood the pressures for war and Kennedy's risks for peace, his awareness of his own death was realistic. He understood systemic power. He knew who his enemies were and what he was up against. He knew what he had to do, from his turn away from the Cold War in his American University address to negotiating peace with Khrushchev and even with Fidel Castro, with whom he was doing back-channel negotiations in the last 3 months of his life. And then withdrawing U.S. troops from Vietnam, as he did by signing a national security memorandum, 1,000 troops out of Vietnam by the end of '63, and everybody out by the end of '65. Conscious of the price of peace, he took the risk. Death did not surprise him. For at least a decade, his favorite poem had been Rendezvous, a celebration of death. Rendezvous was by Alan Seeger, an American poet killed in World War I. The poem was the author's affirmation of his own anticipated death. Before the United States entered the war, Alan Seeger, a recent Harvard graduate, as John Kennedy would be, volunteered for the French Foreign Legion, just as JFK would volunteer to be a PT boat captain out in the Pacific. Alan Seeger was killed on July 4, 1916, while attacking a German position in northern France. The refrain of Rendezvous, "I have a rendezvous with death," articulated John Kennedy's deep sense of his own mortality. These words of an earlier Harvard graduate who, like Kennedy, had volunteered for Warfront, became part of JFK's lifelong meditation on death. It was from the depths of his PT boat crew members in the Pacific. It was from drifting in the dark waters of Ferguson Passage, as he did during that time, toward the open ocean in a circle that almost took him into the ocean permanently. It came from the early deaths of his brother Joe and sister Kathleen, and from the recurring near-death experiences of his almost constant illnesses from childhood. The words of his American University address were heartfelt. He says in the American University address, "We are all mortal." He recited Rendezvous to Jacqueline in 1953, their first night home in Hyannis after their honeymoon. She memorized the poem and recited it back to him over the years. In the fall of 1963, Jackie taught the words of the poem to their 5-year-old daughter, Caroline. It was Caroline who then gave Rendezvous its most haunting rendition. On the morning of October 5, 1963, President Kennedy was meeting with his National Security Council in the White House Rose Garden. Caroline suddenly appeared at her father's side. She said she wanted to tell him something. He tried to divert her attention while the meeting continued. He told her to go see her mother, who was riding a horse on the other side of the lawn. Caroline persisted. She kept tugging away at him. The president smiled, and he turned his full attention to his daughter. He told her to go ahead. While the members of the National Security Council sat and watched, Caroline looked into her father's eyes and she said, "I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death when spring brings back blue days and fair. It may be he shall take my hand and lead me into his dark land and close my eyes and quench my breath. It may be I shall pass him still. I have a rendezvous with death on some scarred slope of battered hill when spring comes round again this year and the first meadow flowers appear. God knows 'twere better to be deep, pillowed in silk and scented down, where love throbs out in blissful sleep, pulse nigh to pulse and breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear. But I've a rendezvous with death at midnight in some flaming town, when spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledged word am true, I shall not fail that rendezvous." After Caroline said the poem's final word, rendezvous, Kennedy's national security advisors sat in stunned silence. One of them, describing the scene 3 decades later, said the bond between father and daughter was such that it was as if there was an inner music he was trying to teach her. John Kennedy had been listening to the music of death for years. He had no fear of it, indeed welcomed hearing that music so long as he could remain faithful to it. From repetition and reflection, I have a rendezvous with death, with its anticipated parallel to the end of his own journey, may have become his personal refrain alongside Lincoln's prayer. Now hearing his own acceptance of death from the lips of his 5-year-old daughter, while surrounded by a National Security Council that opposed his breakthrough to peace, he may have once again deepened his pledge not to fail that rendezvous. As he had written to himself during a midnight flight 2 years earlier, Kennedy knew there was a God, and he saw a storm coming. The storm he feared was nuclear war. If God had a place for him, a rendezvous with death that might help avert that storm on humanity, he believed that he was ready. So let's just talk about any questions you have. Well, Vincent Bugliosi, as you perhaps know, is elaborating on the Warren Commission report and saying that there was a lone assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, and the way I've found to read Mr. Bugliosi's book is to pick out the parts that I understand well because of research I've done, in particular witnesses. And to be frank, I don't find anything there, to be perfectly frank. What would he say if he were listening to this? I think he would raise questions. I don't think he would deal with the questions about the larger issues of what President Kennedy was doing, because he doesn't deal with that very much. I think he would try to tear apart any witness that I would cite, no matter who the witness is, and that what he would do is would ask all kinds of questions about every witness, and I cite many, many witnesses. That would be his position. What was the second part? What would be
the strongest part towards making your case?
I think for me, the strongest part is what John Kennedy was doing. I think in terms of the particular examples of witnesses, you can build all kinds of things that are not consistent with Mr. Bugliosi's position. But if you understand what John Kennedy's doing, it would be surprising if he weren't assassinated. John Kennedy was taking a position which, at the height of the Cold War, was very remarkable. I didn't understand it at all while he was alive. And for him to have done that, and for him to have said the kind of things he said, and to have carried them out, for example, after the Bay of Pigs, when he was betrayed by the CIA, manipulated into doing things that he didn't want to do, and then refused to do, and when he said, I want to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, he was taking a position against his national security state that profoundly threatened his life. And I think that's the strongest part of any case. It's the story. Let me say that I believe that we wouldn't be here tonight had Kennedy not been willing to take that kind of a position against his national security state. We wouldn't be. It would be a nuclear wasteland. So when Thanksgiving falls, which always falls around the time of his assassination, and last year was exactly on the same day, November 22, 2007, I give special thanks for him, because I believe that had he not been willing to go that route, we wouldn't have a world today. Yes, I think that a very key moment in the campaign was when Ted and Caroline Kennedy endorsed Barack Obama. And it wasn't simply their endorsement, it was where they endorsed Barack Obama. Does anybody recall where that was? It was at American University. It was at the site. You know, of course, these things are staged and chosen because of their symbolic meaning. And the two Kennedys endorsed Barack Obama at the site of the speech in which John Kennedy envisioned a disarmed world and risked his life doing that. So they were, of course, expressing the hope that Barack Obama, the hope and the belief that he would carry out that vision with the same risks. So we are in a time when I think we are on the verge of either a revolution or a repression. I don't feel that power gets surrendered easily, and I'm especially suspicious of it being surrendered easily by the people who hold power today, or the powers behind those powers. And there's a very important video that Shelley, my wife, and I watched a little while ago, along with Bert Sachs, who's here tonight. It's called The Orange Revolution, and it's about the false, the attempt to assassinate the candidate in the Ukraine for the presidency there 4 years ago, and then the repression and the overturning of the election results. I think we need to be ready for all the same kinds of things in the next 6 months. In the case of the Orange Revolution, the people, same kind of grassroots organizing that's been going around the Obama campaign, those people prepared for the worst because they saw it coming. And I think we might want to be aware of the possibilities and be prepared for the worst also. They were ready to go into the streets before the election happened. They were ready to go into sub-zero. Well, it was very, very cold weather, sub-zero weather in those streets in the Ukraine for weeks on end to keep the government from admitting the elected candidate. And they won. They won the Orange Revolution. We need to be prepared for something like that ourselves, I think, whether it be an assassination attempt, an interposition like a 9/11, a falsified election. All of these are strong possibilities. Yes. Well, supposedly there have been. Howard Hunt is supposed to have issued some kind of a deathbed confession. But there have been many witnesses, key witnesses, who have risked their death and who have actually died as a result of speaking the truth. But so far as a deathbed confession on the part of a high-level person, I don't think that's happened. And I'm not sure that we're going to find that happening. Well, that's basically what I know. Yes, sir.
Who are these high-level people that you say were behind this?
Well, let's give an example. In the case of the Bay of Pigs, John Kennedy fired the top-level CIA people because he thought they were manipulating him and using him. He fired Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA. He fired Richard Bissell, the head of covert action in the CIA. He fired General Cabell, who was a deputy in the CIA. Then what happened to Allen Dulles after he's fired by John Kennedy as head of the CIA, and as Allen Dulles reveals in several key points, develops into a hater of John Kennedy. What happens to Allen Dulles after the assassination of John Kennedy? He is appointed as a member of the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination of John Kennedy. So we have a process here where people outside the boundaries of the United States or outside our kind of conditioning to accept certain things would be asking, have asked, well, you know, why does the chief suspect get hired to investigate the assassination? This is like having the fox, you know, check into the murder of the hens in the hen house. The people that we can trace in documents and by activity in the assassination include James Jesus Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence and who was in charge of Lee Harvey Oswald when he was doing his work in the Soviet Union. They include David Atlee Phillips, who was the master propagandist in the CIA at that time and who establishes the legend that Oswald is moving under. There are key people we can identify, but it goes up to the head of covert action, Richard Helms, who is under, well, who's basically, I think, responsible in major ways. So those are a few of the names. Yes. Well, Thomas Merton, thank you for asking that question. I like talking about Thomas Merton. And also he provides a vision of hope and of understanding that is what I hope is the framework of this story. Very early in John Kennedy's presidency, Merton wrote to a friend in a letter that he had little hope in Kennedy, because he was very skeptical of the JFK at that point. The way he put it was, he's got too much the time and life mentality. He was too superficial, and that for the kind of position he was in, for the office he held, one needed a kind of depth and compassion and self-forgetfulness that one could see, for example, in Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. And then Merton said, if Kennedy were to break through to that by miracle, he would be marked out for assassination. And that's the story. That's the basic story. He did break through to that. It can be seen as a kind of miracle where the two enemies, Kennedy and Khrushchev, become partners in dialogue. That's as big a miracle as I can understand in history, especially at the moment when we almost went up in a nuclear cloud. And Merton raised questions repeatedly that I try to follow through. He saw in the midst of the Cold War building toward what became the missile crisis in Cuba, that there was the greatest danger was a first strike nuclear attack, and he raised that question just on the verge of the missile crisis. He's the only person I know who was doing that at that time from a monastery where he read no newspapers, saw no television, but had his antennae out. He was corresponding with Ethel Kennedy, with many other people all over the world, and he saw things and felt things that many of the rest of the people didn't. And through his eyes, it helped me a lot to understand the developing movement of what Kennedy was up against and what happened when he did break through to that by miracle. And of course, the unspeakable is the larger framework of the assassination, where nobody wants to go any more today than they did then. The unspeakable. Yeah, Bernie? Well, that's kind of a big question. So let me give a small answer to it. I believe that the key to peacemaking is recognizing the humanity of the enemy, seeing the humanity of the enemy, whoever the enemy might be on the part of each of us. And we all have different people or different forces that we identify in people as being on the opposite side. And well, let me give an example of sort of the strange nature of this story. That I don't believe I wrote a story. I believe I discovered one. The story is already there. I mean, these characters are already out there. They all did all this stuff. All I'm doing is trying to describe it, which I found kind of phenomenal the more I got into it. And each of the story of the characters within the story is its own story. So it's a huge canvas of all kinds of people risking their lives for peace and for telling the truth. But at one point I began to wonder, who's the main character in this story? Who is the main character in this story? Let me ask you, who do you think is the main character in this story? Humanity. I think that's a good answer, but it's not the one I came to finally. But I think that's a really good answer. Humanity.
Struggle for peace.
Struggle for peace. I think that's a great answer too. Huh?
The true soul of America.
The true soul of America. Hey, this is great. This is better than the answers I thought of.
Well, I think when you're writing it, you're the main character and the reader reading it.
Well, that's true too. I think that's part of the nature of the process. Well, this may not sound very credible, but the more I thought about just the scene of what happened with Kennedy and Khrushchev, if we really remember, well, some of us weren't there, weren't alive at that time, but if we can get deeply enough into the conflict that they were in, and for example, a scene by Thomas Merton, here was a man who could see profoundly what it was all about. Merton thought a nuclear war was inevitable. He thought it was inevitable in terms of the way people were thinking, acting, and preparing for war in 1962. He didn't know what to do, and he was writing to everybody he could, praying for every way he could. So, who's the chief character in the book? I think the chief character in the book is God. And, it's not like, it's that everything was totally out of control, and then through a kind of incredible process where these two men were communicating secretly with each other over the year previous and smuggling letters back and forth to each other, in the midst of this conflict, they were beginning to trust each other. And there were some other players in that story. One was named Norman Cousins, who was the editor of the Saturday Review, who was going back and forth secretly between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. Another one was named Pope John the 23rd, who was smuggling messages back and forth between the three of them. And Norman Cousins wrote a remarkable memoir that hardly anybody has read after this process was all over, and John the 23rd had died of cancer, and Kennedy and Khrushchev were both gone. And Norman Cousins called it The Remarkable Triumvirate, John F. Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev, and Pope John the 23rd. That the three of them were working secretly with one another to try to turn this world around in 1962 and 1963. It's a remarkable process. And it's all beneath the surface, but so are all the things that count, as Merton understood. And so that's why I kind of felt at the end of it, This is a force that I don't understand that saved us. And that's why I have some hopes that if we are willing to go deeply enough into the darkness, and Kennedy was, and Khrushchev was, anything can happen for the good. But if we don't go into the darkness, it doesn't happen. And maybe a couple more, and then maybe, okay, yes, please. There are certain, let me share a quote with you. This is when we reach questions of your nature. I bring out my quote. This is you ask a very, very profound question. So this is my quote from a member of the Kennedy and Johnson administration, and I interviewed him. I don't think I'll say his name right now. And he had a real deep insight into things at the same time as he was denying the obvious evidence in the Kennedy assassination. I was presenting him with the conflict between what the doctors in Dallas saw at Parkland Hospital and the official photos and x-rays of President Kennedy, which don't correspond at all. The doctors saw a man whose wounds indicated easily that he was being shot from the front, and the x-rays and the photos don't show that at all. And he said there was no question in his mind that the photos and the x-rays were genuine. They had to be. And then he admitted just a little scintilla of doubt, and he said, this is what he said, and to me this kind of sums up the nature of the problem we're talking about. It's not unique to the media, it's kind of common to us all. He said, but if these photos and x-rays are, official photos and x-rays of President Kennedy are not authentic, then you have something of a magnitude beyond common experience that would reflect so devastatingly on our society as a whole and its corruptibility that you don't know how to deal with it. The unspeakable. The unspeakable.